We are daily bombarded with messaging that says that religion is the source of all the world's problems, and that religion is the source of all of your problems personally. The church has hurt you in some way or another. Christians are disgusting hypocrites, and if you want to be happy, you need to deconstruct your faith, you need to become atheist, you need to become agnostic, or at the very least, you need to become spiritual. But by no means, if you want to be happy, do not become religious. But what if they're wrong? I recently came across a study that talked about the connection between religion and mental health, and I immediately expected that this study was going to point out that all mental health conditions are directly connected to religion.
It's all your fault! All your fault!
And I think I expected that because I hear that kind of messaging all the time.
Religion is the source of all your problems.
And just because we hear a message often does not make that message true. And that's why I thought this study was going to be interesting to kind of go over. Now, if you're like me, you're a little skeptical about studies in general.
Good. A skeptic.
Because what one study finds to be true, another study comes along to disprove it and shows that it's not true. And then the confusion sets in of who's right and who's wrong and what do we believe and what studies should we even point to?
Wrong. Wait, you're right.
All that to be said, my goal of this video is not to point to what's right or wrong, but to really just kind of give food for thought on some of the conclusions that this study found.
Just something to think about.
So let's go ahead and dive right into that conclusion. The conclusion of the study said this, is that the more religious you are, the happier you are, and the more meaningful your life is. I want to start with the question, what does it mean to be religious? The study broke it down into three categories. Level of involvement with the religious community, level of commitment to daily religious practices, and the level of application of religious moral and standards that people applied to their lives. So let's start with the level of community involvement. The study showed that the more involvement a person has in their religious community, the greater their level of religiosity. And the greater level of involvement also correlated with the greater level of happiness and meaningfulness in a person's life. I think that this point is super important right now because the average churchgoer is considered a regular if they attend church once every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, that kind of attendance is not going to classify as high involvement. And so in order to be highly involved in a religious community, it's not even going to church once a week, but rather it's going to be involved in the church community multiple times throughout the week. And so we're looking at maybe 2, 3, 4 times would be considered highly involved in a religious community. The second point of religiosity was the level of private religious practices that a person has on a daily basis. This is typically correlated with things like prayer, meditation, and the study of scripture. And so the higher level of daily consistency with scripture or prayer or meditation, along with how many times per day a person is engaged in these private religious practices, also correlate with a higher level of happiness and meaningfulness. The third point of religiosity is at what level do people apply religious morals and standards into their everyday life. The greater the level of application of these morals and standards show a greater level of religiosity. So when it talks about the more religious you are, what the study is saying is the more you implement these 3 things in your life. The higher level of community involvement, the higher level of private practices, and the higher level of application of morals and standards from your religion, that these things are what bring happiness and meaningfulness in your life. But what do we mean by happiness? Well, here's the thing that we have to understand. Happiness is a subjective state that we're in. We are the only ones who can know if we're really happy or not. And our understanding of our subjective happiness is typically on a spectrum of our personal well-being at any given point throughout the time of day. And so at any given point of the day, we can be feeling like we are at a higher level of happiness because our personal well-being is doing well. But then at another point in time in the day, if things go wrong, it may have an effect of our subjective understanding of our personal well-being. Thirdly, when the study says that the more religious you are, the more meaningful life you live, we have to understand this concept of meaningfulness as well. Meaningfulness is also subjective, and it is wrapped up directly with having a sense of purpose and a feeling of making a difference in the world. So the study shows that the greater your level of religiosity, the more meaningful, purposeful, and impactful your life becomes. The study also found something that I thought was really interesting. And not only does the greater level of religiosity provide a happier and more meaningful life, but that same level of religiosity also decreases the overall anxiety that a person experiences and also decreases the overall depression that people experience. Now, being religious does not make you immune to anxiety and depression. Because you are still susceptible to situations that cause anxiety, and you are still susceptible to situations that can make you feel grieved and or depressed. But as a general disorder, the more religious you are, the less anxiety you experience and the less depression that you have in your life. And I think in order to be fair to the study, we have to ask the question, like, why is this the case? Why does being more religious give us greater purpose, give us greater happiness? Why does being more religious decrease our anxiety and decrease our depression? Now, there are a lot of nuances that go into this and understanding all of this, but for the most part, high religiosity accomplishes several things. When you are highly active in a religious community and you are giving of yourself, your time, your energy, and your efforts, when you are doing that, you are creating a greater level of community and support in your life. You feel like you are being seen, you feel like you are being supported, and you feel like if anything ever did go wrong, you would have a group of people who are ready and willing to have your back at any given moment in time. High religiosity also provides a greater level of guidance and purpose in an individual's life. This happens because whenever you are part of a community, there is greater clarity of what the expectations are, not just what the standards and morals are to live by, but there's a lot of support in how to live those out in the right and appropriate way. And so when a person gets a lot more clarity on how to live out the very things that they are learning about, this provides a greater sense of purpose for their life, and it also provides the support that offers greater guidance as they are on this journey. The third thing that high religiosity accomplishes is a higher level of altruism and compassion. And so when an individual is part of a community that is showing just goodwill, love, support, kindness, compassion, this kind of culture and community is the positive reinforcement that a person is looking for. And so as a person's religious involvement increases, so does the increase of altruism and compassion in that person's life, providing a greater level of goodness and grace in that person's life. But what if I don't want to be religious? Will atheism make me happy? The results are actually inconclusive and mixed as to the extent that atheism contributes to happiness and or depression, mostly because actual atheism is its own specific category, and most people who become non-religious actually don't become atheist, but we use atheism as a buzzword in our culture these days. So people who actually become non-religious fall more into the agnostic category and or the spiritual category, which this study did address, and I found really, really interesting, because how many times have we heard people say, I'm spiritual, not religious? What kind of effect does that have on a person's life? This group was largely agnostic, believing that spirituality exists, but they don't claim to follow or subscribe to any particular deity. And the conclusion of this group I found to be the most fascinating. Between the religious, the atheist, the agnostic, and the spiritual agnostic was found to be the person who is most susceptible to mental suffering. So then the question we have to ask is why? Why would a group who is agnostic and spiritual but non-religious be most vulnerable to mental suffering? I don't have any hard data for that, but anecdotally speaking, as a pastor, I have counseled lots and lots of people who have moved from being religious and have moved over to be non-religious. And what I have noticed is the more people claim to be agnostic, spiritual, the more that it makes them susceptible to certain risks of their beliefs. People who claim to be spiritual but non-religious, they fall into a greater risk of isolation and loneliness. Because they became non-religious, they oftentimes will lose the community that they were a part of. And now they find themselves in a place of isolation and loneliness because there's no like-minded community for them to belong to. Along those same lines, people who are non-religious but spiritual have a greater risk of falling into a despair of meaninglessness. There creates inside of them this kind of nihilism that nothing is important and nothing is meaningful, therefore all things are meaningless and I am meaningless. And when you fall into a state of despair of meaninglessness, your subjective perception on the purpose and the meaning of your life begins to fall drastically short. The third risk of being spiritual but non-religious is the risk of self-medicating. Now, I'm not talking about pills or tonics. What I'm talking about is when a person is highly involved in religiosity, there is a certain need in their life that is being met. But as soon as that person moves out of that religious status and becomes spiritual, non-religious, the needs still remain. And without the high levels of religiosity to meet certain needs, there creates a void and a hole that oftentimes longs to be filled. And so when I talk about self-medicating, I'm talking about high-risk behaviors that people choose to participate in order to try to get for themselves a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, maybe a sense of happiness, and a sense of satisfaction. It's also true that people who experience high levels of anxiety and depression will use high-risk behaviors to also try to soothe the suffering that they are experiencing. And the unfortunate part about these high-risk behaviors is they come with high-level consequences. And so these high-risk behaviors may produce in them a level of guilt, a level of shame, a level of frustration, and may ultimately produce some hopelessness that they themselves cannot get out of, only to increase the anxiety and the depression in their life. And it almost reinforces the old adage that if you believe in nothing, you will indeed fall for anything. So here's my conclusion on all this information, and this is what I hope you'll think about. I cannot change the fact that you have been hurt either by the church or by Christians, and that there was some situation that caused you to want to be non-religious. And I'm sorry about that. I'm sorry that that happened to you, and I'm sorry that I can't help fix that for you. And at the same time, two things still remain to be true. One, there are good churches that do exist and are safe communities for you to attend. And two, the more religious you are, the greater your experience of happiness will be and the greater level of meaningfulness that you will find in your life. So what should you do? Here's what I think you should do. I think that you should find a good church that is a safe community that can help you navigate through the confusion and the questions that you have on how to be more religious. And when you find that place, don't hold back from your religious experience. I would encourage you to invest yourself completely into this community. I would encourage you to commit yourself to these daily practices of prayer and worship and meditating and being in Scripture. And I would encourage you to go all in and allow your life to be shaped by the morals and the standards that God has given us in the Bible. Because if you're looking for happiness, there is a profound connection with high levels of religiosity. And the more religious you are, the happier you will be and the more meaningful your life is.